In the very heart of Washington, beneath the cold shadows of monuments and the whisper of American flags waving on every corner, a political earthquake erupted with consequences beyond measure. The American capital, always alive with intrigue, fragile alliances, and sudden betrayals, once again became the epicenter of a storm. Donald Trump, the former president and unquestionable symbol of national division, found himself at the center of a drama few could have predicted. With a move that shocked even his most loyal supporters, he turned directly against one of the most powerful figures in the American judiciary, Susan Monarez. From the marble corridors of power to the tense conversations whispered in private offices, Washington trembled at the thought. Could this be a daring attempt to reshape the very foundations of justice? Or was it, instead, a reckless gamble that could damage America's fragile institutions forever? This was not just another dispute in the turbulent political life of the United States. It was the opening act of a high-stakes confrontation, one destined to reach the Supreme Court, dragging with it layers of personal ambition, hidden rivalries, and the haunting question of how far a man like Trump would go to secure victory. Citizens across the nation watched with unease, sensing that history was being written before their very eyes. Families gathered around televisions, commentators filled the air with speculation, and behind closed doors, Washington elites felt the ground shift beneath them. The storm had just begun. The storm that rattled Washington did not emerge overnight. Behind Donald Trump's audacious move against Susan Monarez lay years of uneasy clashes, calculated rivalries, and a power struggle brewing quietly in the shadows of the American judicial system. Susan Monarez was not just another name on a roster of federal judges. She was a woman who had risen from humble beginnings, carving her way through the labyrinth of U.S. law with a resilience that few could match. Decades of work had earned her the reputation of being incorruptible, a guardian of the bench who valued principle above politics. Her rulings were sharp, her reasoning unbending, and her presence in the courtroom carried the weight of both intellect and authority. But in politics, especially in the volatile atmosphere of Washington, incorruptibility is rarely seen as a virtue by those who wish to bend systems to their will. For Trump, Monarez represented not just an obstacle, but a reminder of the one force he could not completely dominate, the rule of law. Their first collision came years earlier, in one of the many legal battles that surrounded the Trump presidency. Monarez, serving on a panel that reviewed a controversial executive action, wrote a dissenting opinion so piercing that it circulated not only in legal circles but across national media. In that dissent, Susan Monarez did not attack the president personally. Instead, she dismantled the logic of the action itself, citing constitutional boundaries that, in her view, had been overstepped. For Trump, the sting was personal. He became convinced that beneath her judicial reasoning lay a political agenda designed to weaken him. From that moment forward, their paths were destined to cross again. When Trump lost power but refused to step silently into political retirement, he carried with him not only his unwavering base of supporters but also a long list of names he considered adversaries. High among them was Susan Monarez. Allies say that his resentment deepened over time, fueled by every court decision that seemed to limit his reach and every headline that reminded the world of judges who dared to stand against him. Monarez, on the other hand, appeared unmoved by the political drama. Her commitment to her role remained steady, her life in Washington defined more by long hours of judicial work than by social or political circles. Yet, her silence, her refusal to play into the theater, only seemed to irritate Trump further. The tipping point came when Trump and his legal team began facing escalating challenges tied to his post-presidency actions. Several of these cases, coincidentally or not, found their way into courts where Monarez's influence, either directly or indirectly, was felt. She became, in Trump's eyes, the embodiment of a judiciary that had turned its back on him. And in the corridors of Mar-a-Lago, advisers whispered that removing Monarez could tilt future outcomes in his favor, a move that would not only humiliate an adversary but reshape the game itself. Still, the path Trump chose was unprecedented. Attempting to push a sitting judge of Monarez's stature out of power was not a strategy Washington had seen in modern times. It was bold, dangerous, and fraught with risk. Legal analysts immediately warned of chaos if the move were to succeed, setting a precedent that could throw into question the independence of the entire judiciary. Yet for Trump, risk had always been part of his DNA. His career was a series of gambles. Some failed spectacularly, others crowned him with victories. To him, this was simply another roll of the dice, one with stakes higher than ever before. Meanwhile, Washington buzzed. Senators whispered nervously in private dinners, lobbyists speculated on how to position themselves, and even foreign diplomats watched carefully, knowing that what happened to Susan Monarez could have ripple effects across the international perception of American democracy. And Susan? She remained silent. Her colleagues described her as composed, perhaps even serene, carrying out her duties as if the storm around her were nothing but distant thunder. But inside her chambers, the pressure was unbearable. Anonymous letters, threats, and relentless pressure from media pundits began to pierce her once impenetrable armor. For the first time in her long career, Monarez faced not just the scrutiny of the law, but the raw force of political vengeance. It was clear now, the battle was no longer private. Trump had thrown the gauntlet, and Monarez was standing in the eye of a storm. The future of judicial independence, the credibility of the American legal system, and perhaps even the balance of democracy itself were now entangled in their conflict. And as the case climbed its way up the legal ladder, the Supreme Court loomed ahead, a final arena where power, principle, and politics would collide in a drama destined to echo through history. The lines had been drawn. The question was no longer whether the fight would happen, but what would be left standing once it was over. The corridors of Washington grew heavier with whispers as the conflict between Donald Trump and Susan Monarez escalated. What had begun as a personal vendetta was now transforming into a constitutional crisis, inching dangerously closer to the highest judicial body in the nation, the Supreme Court. From the very start, Trump's lawyers understood the gravity of their mission. To remove a figure like Monarez would require not only relentless legal maneuvering but also the careful orchestration of political pressure behind closed doors. No legal argument, no matter how forcefully delivered, could survive on its own without the backing of senators, lobbyists, and donors willing to gamble their reputations. And so the campaign began. Meetings were held at midnight in hidden corners of Washington's most exclusive clubs, where wealthy allies listened to Trump's case in exchange for whispered promises of influence. Drafts of legal briefs were circulated not just among attorneys but through networks of political operatives eager to test which narrative would strike hardest at the heart of Monarez's credibility. Day by day, the momentum built. Conservative commentators took to the airwaves, framing Monarez not as a respected judge, but as a symbol of judicial overreach. They painted her rulings as evidence of bias, suggesting that she had long abandoned neutrality in favor of an unspoken political mission. It was a narrative as cunning as it was dangerous. Redefine Monarez not as a guardian of justice, but as a partisan enemy. Trump's allies in Congress fanned the flames. Rumors leaked of a movement to investigate Monarez's past cases, searching desperately for inconsistencies that could be spun into scandal. Although no evidence of misconduct emerged, the repetition of suspicion was enough to plant doubt in the minds of everyday citizens. Washington understood well the terrifying power of perception. Proof was not always needed when innuendo could accomplish just as much. Meanwhile, within judicial circles, unease spread like wildfire. Judges who had once spoken casually of Monarez with admiration now found themselves whispering about their own safety. If Susan can be targeted, one judge quietly remarked to a colleague, then we all can. For many, the battle was no longer just about Monarez. It was about whether the judiciary itself could withstand direct assault from political power. The pressure mounted until finally, the decision came. The legal challenge would indeed climb to the Supreme Court. The announcement shook Washington to its core. For the first time in decades, the highest court in the land would hear a case that, while cloaked in constitutional technicalities, was, at its heart, a battle of raw political will. As the news broke, television networks interrupted programming with flashing banners, and pundits rushed to fill the void with speculation. Would the court serve as the final line of defense for judicial independence, or would it bend under the weight of political pressure? For Trump, it was the showdown he had been preparing for, a stage grand enough to match his appetite for drama, a trial not of law alone, but of history itself. Behind the marble facade of the Supreme Court building, the atmosphere carried a heavy tension. Clerks shuffled quickly through halls, justices met behind locked doors, and every scrap of information leaked to the press was dissected with obsessive detail. The city itself seemed to hold its breath. Susan Monarez, for her part, remained publicly silent. But those close to her described late nights in her chambers, poring over documents, anticipating arguments, and quietly bracing for the spectacle to come. She knew the battle that awaited her was larger than herself. It was about the preservation of the judiciary's independence, about whether judges could survive the storm of politics unleashed against them. Outside, crowds began to gather on the steps of the court. Supporters of Trump waved banners demanding Monarez's removal, chanting slogans of loyalty to the man they called their champion. On the other side, protesters raised placards defending judicial integrity, warning that the erosion of one judge's protection could unravel the very fabric of democracy. The steps of the court had become an emotional battleground, the nation itself divided for all to see. The stakes could not have been higher. If Trump prevailed, a precedent would be set that presidents and their allies could dismantle judicial figures they saw as obstacles. If Monarez held her ground, the blowback could cement her as a symbol of judicial courage but infuriate Trump's base further, deepening the nation's divisions. At night, Washington buzzed with speculation. In restaurants and smoky backrooms, the same question echoed endlessly. How would the 9 justices of the Supreme Court rule? Would they shield Monarez and the independence of the judiciary, or would fear, ideology, and the grinding machine of politics force their hand? The curtain was rising on a battle unlike any the court had seen in recent memory. It was no longer just about Susan Monarez. It was about the balance of power, the survival of democratic norms, and the question of whether the United States could withstand the tremors of a political earthquake shaking its very core. The world now turned its eyes to the Supreme Court, where law would meet power, and destiny itself seemed to hang in the balance. The morning the hearings began, Washington awoke to a city transformed. Security barriers surrounded the marble steps of the Supreme Court, patrols of armed officers kept watch, and crowds, frenzied, passionate, divided, filled the streets. From dawn, the air was thick with shouts of protest and chants of support. This was no ordinary case. This was history unfolding in real time. Inside, marble columns cast long shadows across the Grand Hall as the 9 justices prepared to hear arguments that would shake the foundations of American democracy. The hushed silence of the chamber stood in stark contrast to the chaos outside. Every eye in the nation was turned towards this courtroom. Journalists packed the press gallery. Clerks carried stacks of filings as if handling sacred texts. And at the center of it all stood the unseen figure of Susan Monarez, her reputation, her integrity, her career, all on trial. Trump arrived not in person, but through the fiery presence of his legal team. They were combative, seasoned, and determined to reframe the case not as an act of revenge but as a righteous crusade against judicial bias. Their strategy was simple. Paint Monarez not as an impartial figure but as a rogue judge whose decisions undermined presidential authority and national security. The narrative had been sharpened for weeks in televised interviews and op-eds until it gleamed like a weapon. As the lead attorney rose to speak, his voice echoed through the chamber. He spoke of constitutional responsibility, of the people's will, of a judiciary that had lost its way. There, laid out in solemn words, was the claim that one judge had betrayed her oath, and that justice required her removal. To Trump's supporters watching at home, it sounded like vindication. To critics, it was a dangerous rewriting of the separation of powers. When Monarez's defense was presented, the tone shifted. Her counsel spoke calmly but firmly, invoking the fundamental principle that American law rests upon, the independence of the judiciary. Judges, they reminded the court, are sworn not to presidents, not to parties, but to the Constitution itself. To allow politics to unseat a sitting judge would not only endanger Monarez, but unravel safeguards that had protected the Republic for centuries. Their argument was clear. This was not about one judge, it was about the survival of judicial impartiality in the face of political wrath. Behind the bench, the justices listened intently, their faces unreadable. Yet their very presence seemed to carry centuries of weight. Some leaned forward, asking pointed questions that cut through rhetorical flourishes. Others remained silent, taking notes in tight, careful script. Every furrowed brow, every raised eyebrow, sent waves of speculation rippling through the observers. Outside, TV anchors dissected the live updates with breathless urgency, guessing at which way the court might lean. But the real drama was not only in the words spoken aloud. It pulsed quietly through hidden corridors and private chambers. Washington insiders whispered of justices being discreetly approached in social circles, of phone calls from influential senators, of well-timed leaks designed to sway public opinion. No proof of tampering reached the headlines, but everyone knew the truth. Politics had seeped into the very walls of the court. Throughout the proceedings, Susan Monarez herself remained silent. She did not testify aloud, nor did she make public appearances. Her presence, however, lingered in every phrase the lawyers spoke, in every silent pause of the justices, in every protest cry carried into the hall by faint echoes from the streets. She became both target and symbol, a woman bearing the weight of a nation's struggle with power. As days turned into weeks, the hearings twisted into a spectacle. Television ratings soared. Commentators turned legal intricacies into soundbites tailored for divided audiences. Families argued at dinner tables. Strangers clashed in coffee shops. The United States itself felt caught in an unrelenting trial, the country judged alongside Monarez. And in the court, the tension grew unbearable. Some justices pressed Trump's team to explain how far their logic extended. Could any president demand the removal of judges who opposed them? Was this not the very tyranny the Constitution sought to prevent? Others questioned Monarez's defenders. How could the judiciary remain beyond reproach if no mechanism existed to check its excesses? Each exchange revealed the stakes with piercing clarity. By the time closing arguments were delivered, the air in the chamber was electric. No one doubted that the ruling would alter the trajectory of American history. The question was no longer whether the court could decide, but whether it could survive deciding. When the gavel struck and the hearings closed, silence swept the room like a sudden tide. Outside, the crowds erupted, half in defiance, half in celebration. Nothing yet had been resolved, but everyone knew that the justices were retreating into the privacy of deliberation. Behind locked doors, 9 individuals would now wrestle with a decision too heavy for any one person to bear. The fate of Susan Monarez, Donald Trump's gamble, and the independence of the judiciary itself now rested in their hands. The world waited, holding its breath. Once the doors of the Supreme Court closed, Washington could only speculate. Outside, the city buzzed with protests and television panels. Inside, in the soundproof chambers of the court, 9 justices sat around the long mahogany table, their faces etched with the gravity of history. Here, far from cameras and public chants, the real battle now unfolded. Tradition dictates that the Chief Justice speaks first, opening the round of deliberations with his preliminary views. That morning, his voice was steady, but those who knew him heard the weight beneath it. He emphasized the danger of allowing political precedent to dictate judicial independence. Yet he also admitted the growing public sentiment that judges must be held accountable. His words set the tone, cautious, measured, aware that the balance of democracy itself was trembling in their hands. Around the table, divisions began to emerge. Some justices, wary of Trump's influence but equally mindful of Monarez's growing symbolic stature, worried that a ruling explicitly in her favor might ignite political fury strong enough to destabilize institutions further. They feared not just the decision itself, but the consequences beyond the courtroom. Riots, unrest, the collapse of faith in the judiciary. Others argued passionately that yielding even an inch to political pressure would be catastrophic. If we allow one judge to fall because of politics, one justice warned, then none of us are safe. Today it's Susan Monarez. Tomorrow it could be any one of us. Their words reverberated in the wood-paneled room, echoing the deepest anxieties of the court. The justices debated furiously. Constitutional precedents were laid on the table, one after another. Landmark rulings about judicial independence, executive authority, and separation of powers. Clerks provided stacks of memos, each thick with citations from centuries of American jurisprudence. But beneath the law, emotion simmered. Fear, pride, the shadow of history. Outside those doors, politics marched on. Influential senators lobbied indirectly, giving subtle interviews meant to reach the ears of certain justices. Wealthy donors held private gatherings where speculation about the court's direction blended with veiled threats about elections to come. Even foreign leaders, watching from afar, expressed concern through diplomatic channels. America's reputation as a nation of laws was now entangled with the fate of this single decision. Yet inside the chambers, the world shrank to 9 voices. Rumors seeped out of heated arguments that stretched late into the night. One justice reportedly slammed his fist on the table, declaring that to bend now would erase the very foundation of the republic. Another remained quiet throughout much of the debate, studying his notes, weighing every word, his eventual vote considered pivotal. Their ideological lines did not always predict their positions. Some conservatives leaned toward defending Monarez, viewing Trump's attack as unconstitutional overreach. Some liberals hesitated, fearing that defending her too forcefully would feed Trump's narrative of a biased judiciary. The issue was no longer right versus left, it was survival versus collapse. Meanwhile, Susan Monarez continued her daily routines, fully aware that her life's work hung in the balance of voices she had no power to influence. Those close to her described her as calm but reflective, often walking the quiet streets of her neighborhood at night, her mind racing with the possibility that everything she had built might be undone by politics. Neighbors, once accustomed to passing her unnoticed, now glanced at her with reverence, as though she had transformed into a reluctant symbol of courage. The justices, too, felt the unbearable burden of symbolism. Each vote, each argument carried not only legal weight but moral consequence. They debated drafts of possible majority and dissenting opinions, each word scrutinized like a scalpel's cut. How much to mention Trump by name? How far to go in defending Monarez's role? Would their decision resonate for decades or fuel chaos within weeks? In moments of quiet, the room felt almost sacred. Each justice, alone with their conscience, knew that the world outside was burning with anticipation. Regardless of their ultimate ruling, half the nation would accuse them of betrayal. The court itself, an institution that survived wars, scandals, and centuries of upheaval, now seemed fragile, like glass under strain. As deliberations dragged on, Washington insiders whispered that the court was split closely, dangerously close, with alliances shifting daily. Draft opinions circulated, only to be torn apart and rewritten. Clerks leaked fragments of information that sent shockwaves through media cycles. The court is divided, they said. The future is uncertain. By the end of the week, exhaustion replaced certainty. The justices, drained by the weight of their task, adjourned once more, each retreating into private chambers to think, to write, to wrestle with their conscience alone. But one thing had become clear. No matter how the court ruled, the nation itself would never be the same again. The marble doors remained shut, but in the restless city beyond, America held its breath. The decision was coming. The announcement came on a gray morning, the kind of morning where the sky itself seemed heavy with anticipation. Washington was silent at dawn, but by mid-morning the streets were packed. Barriers surrounded the Supreme Court, journalists swarmed the steps, and citizens, angry, anxious, desperate, stood shoulder to shoulder, waiting for history to be revealed. Inside the marble halls, clerks moved hastily, carrying bound copies of the opinion sealed in manila folders. Hours earlier, the justices had cast their votes for the final time, their deliberations completed after weeks of agonizing debate. Now, the weight of their decision was about to strike not only Susan Monarez and Donald Trump, but an entire nation. At exactly 10 a.m., the courtroom filled. The Chief Justice appeared, face unreadable, his black robe hanging heavily on his shoulders. He began to speak, his voice echoing against the high ceiling, outlining the court's ruling in a calm, deliberate cadence that betrayed none of the fury behind the case. The ruling was close, a 5-4 decision that would forever be etched into American history. The court, in its majority opinion, rejected Trump's attempt to remove Susan Monarez. The justices declared that the judiciary stood as an independent branch of government, immune from the storms of partisan vendetta. To allow otherwise, they wrote, would dissolve the very principle of separation of powers and plunge the republic into dangerous territory. The language was clear, firm, unyielding. Judicial independence is not a privilege, the opinion declared. It is the shield that safeguards liberty itself. Gasps filled the courtroom. Outside, chants erupted into chaos, cheers of triumph clashing against cries of outrage. Some wept in relief, while others screamed betrayal. The ruling did not settle the nation, it ignited it. For Susan Monarez, the decision was both a victory and a sentence. She remained on the bench, her integrity affirmed, but she became a permanent target in the eyes of Trump's supporters. Praise poured in from legal scholars and international leaders, framing her as a symbol of courage. Yet anger flared among millions convinced she embodied exactly the corruption Trump had warned against. In a single moment, she transformed from a respected judge into one of the most polarizing figures in America. Donald Trump, despite the loss, did not retreat. Stepping in front of cameras later that day, he denounced the ruling as proof of a rigged system and vowed to take his fight to the political arena. His words electrified his supporters, who stormed social media with declarations of war against what they now called the judicial elite. For Trump, defeat was simply a new weapon, one he wielded to rally his base, stronger and angrier than before. In Washington, senators scrambled to calculate their next moves. Some accused the court of cowardice, while others praised its defense of the Constitution. Political strategists spoke of a new era, one where faith in the judiciary would be forever contested, where every major decision would be filtered through suspicion and division. But the true impact extended far beyond politics. Ordinary citizens, already weary from years of division, now stood at a crossroads of trust. Could they still see the Supreme Court as impartial? Or had it become just another battlefield in America's endless partisan war? Across dinner tables, in workplaces, in churches, the arguments echoed. Familiar bonds strained. Communities cracked. And for the justices themselves, the burden did not end with the ruling. Threats increased. Security details expanded. One justice, speaking privately to a colleague, admitted, "We saved the court today. But I don't know if we saved the country." Those words, never meant for the public, captured the essence of the moment. Victory written in the books of law, but uncertainty etched into the soul of the nation. As the sun set on Washington that evening, the city glowed under the orange light of street lamps and television cameras. Crowds lingered, chanting into the night, unwilling to let go of the day's drama. In neighborhoods, people locked their doors, uneasy about what tomorrow might bring. And in her chambers, Susan Monarez sat alone, reading the court's opinion by lamplight. For her, it was vindication, but at a cost she could scarcely name. The earthquake was over, but the ground still trembled. America, bruised and divided, had not found closure, only a fragile moment of pause between storms. The Supreme Court had spoken, but the story of Donald Trump, Susan Monarez, and the struggle over the very meaning of justice was far from finished. The verdict was history. The aftermath was destiny.